Hi there, Dr. Carlos Todd here, and here to talk all things fight less, love more. So what are we talking about today? We're talking about a dynamic, a challenge in relationships that is so common, but so not understood. In so many ways, drives so many of the disagreements. How many times have I said so, right? It drives so many of the disagreements in relationships, but even though we're learning more and more about this dynamic, it's something that is still not well understood by many couples. And what is it? And if you understood what it was, right, you will be in a much better place and you wouldn't have these conflicts. But before I share that with you, I'm going to talk a little bit about who I am. My name is Dr. Carlos Todd. I have been a therapist for the last 25 years, and I help people fight less, love more. I do couples work. I also provide consultation services to organizations, and I also run a website called masteringanger.com that provides anger management courses across the entire United States and beyond. So today we're going to talk about couples and the issues around conflicts. The specific topic is anxious avoidant dynamics, sometimes called the distance pursuer. In some ways, sometimes it's called the run chase cycle. But no matter all the academic names, the reality of it, this is a situation where you have somebody's chasing the connection and somebody else is running. What it feels like is that you're wanting change in the relationship and you're the one that's pushing. The other person seems to be not interested in being part of the growth or recovery process in the relationship. And so that becomes a major issue. So how do we fix this? There are several things that I want you to consider. We try to address this issue. I think the first thing to consider, what is this whole anxious thing? So when we talk about somebody who's anxious in a relationship, we're not talking about someone who is anxious as a diagnosis, right? That they need pills. We're talking about somebody who, when in their relationship, when you look around, you're engaging in the connection with the other person, there's always this sense like there's something wrong. In your mind, you're always just kind of hyper focused on what is wrong, always chasing solutions, always chasing communication. Your mind goes very quickly in a situation where it's a small issue to leave in the relationship, or the other person is going to leave, and you're constantly trying to do things to make that better, to not cause the person to leave, or for you to just decide you're going to leave, right? And so in the relationship, there's this dynamic where you are what we describe as hypervigilant, right? You're just constantly on the lookout for being got, constantly on the lookout for something going wrong in the relationship. And so that's what the anxious partner does. They're constantly pursuing, they always see danger, and they always respond in a way that is hyper-focused on being out in the cold with someone. There are always questions, there's always a need for reassurance, always this kind of attention-seeking behavior, a desire for conversation. Anything that feels like silence, anything that doesn't fit the normal pattern, it feels like rejection. And then once there's a feeling of rejection, then what comes after rejection is the pursuit of that connection. So there's nothing wrong with conversation, obviously. There's nothing wrong with trying to connect with your partner. But if it becomes in your mind a situation where you're doing this because you fear rejection, that is going to be a problem. Because this thing is like a bottomless pit. If you don't talk to me, if you don't respond to me, somehow I believe that we're done, and I have to do what I can so that we can't be done, right? And so that's something that I think you gotta pay attention. What is it that the avoidant partner is actually doing, right? So the anxious person is chasing connection. They want conversation, they want interaction. What is the avoidant doing? So from the perspective of the anxious person, they don't care. You having a conversation with your guy, and in some cases your girl, they're just sitting there and they're like, I don't want to have this conversation. And it looks as though they couldn't care less. They don't want to be in the relationship. They just don't want to connect. That's how it feels to the anxious person. But in a lot of cases, the avoidant, they really struggle with communication. They don't know how to express themselves. They don't have good ways or good systems to understand and communicate their emotions. And so a lot of times when the anxious person is speaking or interacting, the avoidant quickly gets overwhelmed. And believe it or not, their withdrawing or their silence is a way of self-soothing. Not to the anxious person, it doesn't feel right, it doesn't give them good vibes, but that's their way of self-soothing. And so you have this mismatch between somebody who wants communication, who wants to talk, who wants reassurance, who wants a sense that you care about me, but the avoidant, on the other hand, overwhelmed by all of this. And so these two things come together to create a dynamic that is so common but so problematic at the same time. And the reason why this happens is because I think the anxiously attached person is accustomed from early childhood in particular to chasing a connection and a parent or somebody not really giving them what they need. And so they find people who are mysterious like that, who believe, because the brain is operating in such a way that it tries to find familiar patterns, not necessarily better patterns, but familiar patterns. Intellectually, you want somebody who's going to communicate, who's going to be open, but you're drawn to somebody who is avoidant, who's withdrawn, they're mysterious. And when you get into the relationship, that pattern fits, but it doesn't provide any real benefit. And the avoidant, on the other hand, is accustomed to somebody chasing connection, but them being overwhelmed and withdrawing. And so they choose somebody who they think in their mind who's going to be good for them, who's open, affectionate, that kind of stuff. But when they get into the relationship, they're overwhelmed. And now we got an issue. The third thing to consider is that, as I expressed a little bit earlier, this cycle feeds on itself. The more anxious the person gets because they're being rejected, they're not getting what they need, the more avoidant the avoidant becomes. And it's like, why is this guy not hearing me? He's not listening to me. He's not providing me with what I need. And for the avoidant, it's like, why does she not leave me alone? Like, I'm really trying to like care, but this is all too much for me. And so this dynamic persists, and there's a point in the relationship where you're not even addressing real issues. What you're doing is addressing, I don't want to be alone. This is all too much. And so anytime that there's communication, the anxious person is focused on avoiding a rejection at all costs, and the avoidant is focused on avoiding being overwhelmed at all costs. You think that you're talking about money, you're talking about sex, you're talking about parenting, you're talking about real issues, but the thing that is driving these conversations is, I don't want to be rejected. This is all overwhelming. And so if you don't get a handle on that dynamic, the relationship struggles. And so how do you get past this situation? In very, very simple terms, the way that you get past the situation is that the avoidant person has to learn how to manage that sense of being overwhelmed, and the anxious person needs to focus very much on how to self-soothe, how to manage that thing in you that fears rejection. Because when you fear rejection, you're going to see rejection everywhere. No matter what the avoidant person does, if you don't have skills to self-soothe and self-manage, no matter what they do, you're going to fear some kind of rejection. And it can be a very small thing, right? They do something for themselves and they don't do something for you. All of a sudden, like, they go to the refrigerator and they get themselves a bottle of water or something and don't bring water for you. And it's like, a simple thing like that can set off a firestorm, because all you're doing is looking out for yourself. You're not looking out for me. And before you know it, we're talking about the end of the relationship. So the anxious person has to learn how to self-soothe, because if you don't, that dynamic enters the conversation and you begin to try to kind of push the issue and seek reassurance, as opposed to addressing a very simple issue. So I think it becomes really important to understand the pattern and how to address the pattern. So what do we do? What else do we do? The anxious person has to learn how to self-soothe, and the avoidant person has to learn how to express themselves effectively and how to avoid being overwhelmed. What are some of the skills that you need to develop? My book, Fight Plan, addresses this. I go through scenarios on the issue of the anxious avoidance cycle where you can address these issues in very clear and direct terms. You want to click the link below for my book, Fight Plan. Any of the other books that I have on manhood, the books that I have on infidelity. There's also a book for Christians on the issue of how do you effectively manage conflict from a biblical standpoint. So click the link below and get a copy of one of my books, and I will see you in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.